Hello and welcome back to this course of videos on Node.js. In this video we are finally going to be creating our web server in Node. So we're going to be creating a server that can listen to requests from the client, from the browser, and respond back to the browser. Now the code you can see up on the screen is from a previous video where we were streaming and we were reading from a text file and writing to a text file. In this video, once we get the request from the browser, we are still going to read from the text file, but instead of writing back to a text file, we're going to write back to the client, to the browser. So the first thing we need to do is to require the HTTP core module. Now, HTTP is the other major core module that you will see in most literature about Node.js. It's used very heavily, but as I said, both of these are core modules in Node.js. Now, the main method that we're going to use on the HTTP core module is the createserver method. Now, interestingly, this createserver method on the HTTP core module actually creates an event emitter. So similar to the read and write streams that we saw here, these event emitters can emit events, such as data events here, and then respond to those events with what we call event handlers, these callback functions. So server can do, our server object here now can do exactly the same. So a key event that we are going to be listening for is the request event. So when the server object emits the request event, we are going to action this callback function, so this event handler. Now, this event handler, this function that we're putting in here, you can see that it's passed two arguments, request and response object. These are very important objects, and interestingly, they too are event emitters. Request and response object are both event emitters, and they have a lot of great properties and methods that we are going to be using. To look at the request object, first of all, the first thing we're going to do is we are going to look at the request.url property. Now, this property here, as you can probably guess, tells us the URL that was requested by the client, by the browser. Now, in this video, we're not going to be adjusting our code based on what URL the user passes. In future videos, in the future videos on routing, we will be doing exactly that. But in this video, regardless of what URL is passed by the client, we'll be reacting in the same way. We just wanted to log this out so you can see the request object in action. So the next thing we need to do is we need to set the header. So we use the response object to set the response header. If you remember back to a previous lesson, HTTP requests and responses have headers and bodies. Now, the header basically is communicating information, kind of metadata, if you like, to the browser about what to expect. Now, the two things that we're going to communicate back to the browser with this write head method on the response object is, first of all, the status code, which is going to be 200 OK. That's the first argument that will pass back to the browser. And the second parameter is an object that you can use. And this object you can use to communicate the response headers. Now, the response headers, the only response header that we are going to communicate back to the browser is the content type. And the content type is going to be text/plain. That is the MIME type of readme.txt. Text is pure text data. MIME type is text/plain. So here we're writing the header of the response by giving it the 200 status OK, and then we are also telling it that the content type is text.plain. So now we've written the header, we can start looking at the body. I'm just going to indent that back in, and we can start looking at the body. Now, I am going to take this data that we wrote to be streaming from readme.txt to writeme.txt, and I'm going to use that data. So I'm just going to cut and paste it. I'm just going to write some comment in here to explain exactly what we're doing, and I'm going to paste it back in there and tidy it up. So you can see what we want to do here is, previously we were reading from readme.txt, writing to writeme.txt. Now we still want to read the text from our text file, but we don't want to write to writeme.txt. We want to write to the response. So first of all, we don't need this second line of code. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the request and response objects are event emitters, and they're actually, to take it a stage further, they're request and response objects. The request object is a readable stream, and the response object is a writable stream. So, of course, we don't need to create a new write stream, because we already have our writable stream, the response object. So instead of, we're still going to be reading using the read stream, and if you remember from the previous video, when the buffer, the memory buffer was filled with its first chunk, it would emit the data event, and this data event has a callback function or an event handler, and it passes through the chunk of data that was read as its argument. So we're still going to be using this, but obviously instead of creating our write stream and using that to write, we can simply replace my write stream with response. So like I said, response is a writable stream. So we can write our chunk of data to this writable stream when we have the data event emitted by the read stream. So one thing we need to do now, an extra thing we need to do now, is we're going back and using the server object that we created at the start, and we need to tell it to listen to requests. We haven't told it that yet, so it's a simple method. We just say server.listen. Now we need to pass it two parameters. The first parameter is the port we want it to listen on, and the second parameter is the URL we want it to listen on. The port we want it to listen on is 8080. You can do 8000, 3000. There's multiple. You're pretty free to do whatever you want. 8080 is quite common, so that's the one I use. The second parameter that we're passing in is the URL, and I am passing in localhost, which is 127.0.0.1. To remind you, localhost is basically a web server on your local machine, and this is the URL for it. I'm just going to put some comment. I want a console log on here so we know that the server is now listening, so we can see that logged out when we test. Now, one last thing we need to do that we haven't done yet is when writing to the response. So response is a writable stream. When writing to this particular writable stream, we need to tell it when we're finished. So what we're going to do is, there on the readable stream, the readable stream emits an end event when it has finished reading. So we want to use that, and we want to say, okay, when the read stream has finished reading on end, we then want to tell the response, our response object, that the writing is over, that to finish the writing and complete the transaction. So we're going to, again, this is we're going to use the event emitter on end. We're going to pass it a callback function. Now this callback function, we're going to say response.end. Now that tells that's informing the response object that the write is complete, and that can actually end our transaction. Now that's pretty much all the code here. I'm just going to console.log that the stream has finished, the read stream has finished writing to the response object. That's basically what happened when you called this response.end. So now we're going to actually test our code here. I'm just going to save it. And the first thing we need to do is we need to, when we run this create server, what we're going to see is the server listen method is going to be actioned, and we should see this console log to say the server is now listening. So if I go back to my git bash and I just run my node.createserver, what we should see, server now listening on localhost port 8080. So what we're going to do now is, so now this server is now listening, so all this code is ready to go. This server event emitter is waiting for this request event so it can action all this wonderful code that we did. So we just need to make a request to port 8080 127.0.0.1. So I'm going to go to and open up my Google Chrome browser, and I am going to I'll write localhost. I could either have written localhost or 127.0.0.1. I'm going to say localhost, and I'm going to specify the port. So colon after the URL localhost port. I can put my port after the colon 8080. So if I hit this, you will see it has responded back with our data from readme.txt. And if we go back to the console, if we go back to our git bash console, we'll be able to see there is our console.log when we did. So I need to get back to my Visual Studio Code here. We console.log client requested plus request.url. So this is, the slash is basically the root. We didn't specify any URL past localhost, so that was basically the root. And then it says read stream has now finished writing to response object, which we can see it's finished writing to response object, because the response object was our basically writing back to our client, our browser, which you can see here. Just to clear this up, Node, it's actually responded twice. So we did one request, but it came back with two responses, because the second response was just the favicon object. I just want to clear that up so there's no confusion, but I wouldn't worry about that. So I hope this gives you a good understanding of creating a server, this event emitter, which is a server, and then these two very important request and response objects, which are also event emitters and are actually readable stream and writable stream, and that's what we use to listen for requests, receive requests, and respond back to the browser. So I look forward to seeing you in our next video.